Swadika, and a very good afternoon to all. Welcome to the seminar on responsible investment in practice, undertaking stewardship with a focus on climate change. My name is Pami Sinida Petvilakun, and I will be your master of ceremonies for today's event. Today's seminar aims to enhance the capability of capital market participants on the facet of engagement with the issuer of securities to deal with the risk associated with climate change in the context of the investment process to enhance sustainable business, which leads Thailand towards a low carbon economy. So the webinar is proudly co-organized by the United Nations, PRI, Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, or AIGCC, and the SEC Thailand. As a background, the PRI works to understand the investment implications of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG factors, and support institutional investors to protect the portfolio from climate-related risk, to identify new opportunities and outline processes to help asset owners engage on the topics. Therefore, in supporting the Thai investors and market participants in the incorporation of responsible investment policy, investment process, and stewardship practices. So the first session of today's agenda will begin with a presentation on stewardship, voting and engagement practices, which we honored to have Ms. Bonnie Groves, Specialist Stewardship Principal for Responsible Investment, or PRI, and Ms. Valerie Kwan, Director, Engagement, Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, or AIGCC, for the presentation. And next, for the second session, will be an investor panel discussion on engagement and climate change, which we've been honored by many speakers who are extensive expertise in the topic. And then the final part of the webinar will be a Q&A session. So having said that, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box and we'll take all questions at the Q&A session. These are the agenda of what you can expect through today's program. On this occasion, I would like to invite Mr. Thawachai Pitayasopon, Acting Secretary General, Securities and Exchange Commission, Thailand, to deliver the opening remark. Mr. Thawachai, please.
ครับสวัสดีครับ Good afternoon. Ms. Geeta Saprawal, United Nations Resident Coordinator in Thailand, Mr. James Robertson, Head of Asia, ex-China and Japan, PRI, Ms. Valerie Kwan, Director of Engagement, Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to be with you this afternoon at this webinar on responsible investment in practice, undertaking stewardship with the focus on climate change, organized by the SEC Thailand, the UN, PRI, and the IGCC. On behalf of the SEC Thailand, may I extend a very warm welcome to all participants who join us today. This webinar is under the flagship of Responsible Investment Series. It is in fact the third of webinar series which the SEC Thailand has organized in partnership with the UN and PRI. The first one was held in December 2021, and the second in last September. The objective of this webinar series is to introduce the principle of responsible investment, or PRI, to the Thai market participants. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to be here today because there is not a more globally relevant discussion right now than the mission to find practical climate solutions. As you might be aware, Thailand is one of the top 10 countries in the world at high risk of long-term climate change. Extreme heat and rising sea levels threaten part of Thailand, including the capital city of Bangkok. The failure to address rising temperature and extreme weather events will damage not only the ecosystem, but also be a threat to every human living in this nation. Thankfully, we are now witnessing a growing commitment across multiple fronts at the governmental, corporate, and public levels, supported by independent bodies such as UN, PRI, and AIGCC, who are present here today, that have put climate action squarely on the national and global agenda. For companies, failure to address climate risk will have serious long-term repercussions on their resilience. The public expectation on responsible corporate behavior has risen over the past decade, and companies are now being assessed on how they handle social and environmental issues, including climate risk related to their businesses. Having said that, as the market regulators, the SEC Thailand recognized that the G of good governance is equally important to the E and S pillars. When it comes to ESG discussion, the SEC Thailand believes that good governance is the foundation of the corporate environmental stewardship and social responsibility. To promote good governance practices among the Thai institutional investors, which include the asset owner, asset manager, and financial intermediaries who manage assets on behalf of the clients and beneficiaries. The SEC Thailand has introduced the Investment Governance Code for Institutional Investor or I-Code since 2017. As of today, there is a total of 81 I-Code signatories who have committed to integrating stewardship and investment, including material, environmental, social, and governance issues to fulfill the responsibilities of creating long-term value for their investment owner and beneficiaries. While the past year may have been challenging, I am delighted to share that the SEC Thailand had rolled out several initiatives to facilitate growth for financial intermediaries. For example, last year, the SEC Thailand supported the CFA Institute in creating publication on guidance for integrating ESG information into equity analysis and research reports to enhance investment analyst capabilities in integrating ESG information and related risks into the analysis and valuation. In addition, to further enhance asset managers' intermediation capabilities, last year, the SEC Thailand issued a regulations relating to sustainable and responsible investing fund or SRI fund, aiming to enhance disclosure on sustainability related to features of mutual funds. These, at the same time, would help facilitate the growth in the fund management industry by providing investors with more investment options and transparency. Also, at the end of last year, we issued the guideline on management and disclosure of climate-related risks by asset managers in December 2022. The guideline aimed to assist and guide asset managers in establishing a responsible investment framework by setting out the SEC Thailand expectation on the development and implementation of practices, policy, and procedures in managing material climate risk in investment portfolio, as well as facilitate meaningful disclosure while driving positive impacts and change. However, let us be reminded that sustainability is a holistic journey. More needs to be done, as we cannot afford to delay the shift towards the greener capital markets and a low carbon economy. The private sector, including institutional investors, asset managers, as well as other financial intermediaries, must step up to provide momentum for a robust and sustainable transition towards achieving the nationally determined contribution or NDC in reducing the greenhouse gas emission of at least 20% by 2030 and net zero greenhouse gas emission by 2065. I understand that this is more challenging than this time. Capital market participants could help Thailand to achieve these desired targets and impacts by embracing climate-related risk consideration into business strategies and investment decisions, as well as shifting the approach from exclusion to active participation with asset owners, asset managers, and financial intermediaries acting as the stewards of climate action. As the old saying goes, tide and time wait for no man. The time frame for us to make the necessary and fundamental change is tightening. All stakeholders, including regulators such as the SEC Thailand, companies, and institutional investors who are participating here today, must play a part to help Thailand achieve the Sustainable Development Goals as well as climate agenda. After all, we are all facing these sustainability challenges together. Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, I'd like to thank experts from the PRI and ARGCC who have put together today's program and are willing to share their knowledge and insights, particularly on how to undertake stewardship with the focus on climate change. I am certain that, like me, you are all eager to listen and learn from their wealth of experiences. Please also allow me to take this opportunity to give my heartfelt appreciation to Ms. Geeta Sabrawal, United Nations Resident Coordinator in Thailand, and Mr. James Robertson from PRI for your strong commitment and continuous support in encouraging our market participants to integrate the sustainability issues into their investment and ownership decisions, as well as to become PRI signatories. Let us seize this opportunity to learn from each other and work together towards an inclusive, sustainable, and resilient future for our people and planet. On that note, thank you for being here today. I do hope that you will find this session engaging and productive. ขอบคุณครับ
Thank you very much. Acting Secretary General, Securities and Exchange Commission Thailand, Mr. Thawatchai Pitayasopon, for honoring us with the opening notes and for your strong commitment in driving Thai capital market towards sustainable development. And next on the agenda, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to have the honor of Ms. Geeta Sabrawal, the United Nations Resident Coordinator in Thailand, to kindly welcome the participants, please.
Thank you, Swabita. Thawatchai, Acting Secretary General, Securities and Exchange Commission, the PRI team, along with AIGCC, distinguished investors, business leaders, and colleagues. I'm honored to join you at this important seminar that will provide in-depth knowledge for investors on climate action at a juncture where accelerating the SDGs will be pivotal for the future of the planet, people, and economy. Let me thank the co-host for making this event possible. My special thanks goes to the Securities and Exchange Commission team for your role in supporting the establishment of a sustainable investment ecosystem for the private sector, banks, and investors to accelerate sustainable and green transition. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to the panelists joining us online. Importantly, all the speakers today are women from leading global investment hubs, a demonstration of women's power as we lead the thinking in support of the green transformation. Today's event is a great opportunity to hear from these women directly of what has worked in their companies as they scale up support for climate and to adapt them to the investment context in capital markets have a huge influence on the economy and are one of the key drivers of sustainable growth in time. With this comes great responsibility on the private sector, as companies, large and small, will be vital to advancing the green transformation by increasing investment to support deep decarbonization across the industry. Analysis suggests that Thailand's green infrastructure requires an initial investment of about $32 billion. This can be reached if the threshold for green lending and investment is set for as low as 6.3%. ESG provides the framework for these investments while adhering to the principles of responsible investment, adds to businesses' credibility and supports the standardization of these laws. It's heartening to see that interest in PRI is growing in Thailand, with the SEC playing a critical role in owning this agenda and putting in place measures to avoid greenwashing. Importantly, green investments are not only beneficial for the environment, but they also impact bottom lines positively in the medium to long term. We've seen this in Thailand, where the private sector is scaling up investments in clean technologies in the steel, aluminum, and lead industry at their own cost, based on pilots undertaken by the UN together with the Ministry of Industry. This follows a global trend where investments in sustainable funds have consistently outperformed traditional funds by nearly a percentage point. Our panelists, I am sure, will speak to this issue based on their own experience. Equally critical is investment stewardship. This will require bankers, investors, and asset managers to work closely with CEOs of large companies and SMEs alike in handholding and promoting green pathways for business operations. This transition needs to be managed in the shift from unsustainable to sustainable resources and practices. In the context of Thailand, government's policy framework sets this as a priority in line with the country's BCG policy agenda. This is reflected in an ongoing shift to turn the country into a manufacturing hub for EVs and in efforts to eliminate single-use plastic. These are opportunities that need to be leveraged by the private sector in its transition to low carbon and green finance. The UN comes into this equation by bringing to bear best available technologies and environmental practices combined with integrated policy advice in close partnership with the government and the private. This is resulting in an increase in co-financing for green projects to the tune of close to $131 million, which will need to be scaled up even further for accelerating this transformation. We also need to leverage the bond markets to scale up capital generation. Currently, less than 1% of the global bond market prioritizes green investment. Yet, when these investments are leveraged, the results prove transformative. For example, the government of Indonesia, with technical assistance from the UN, introduced nearly 750 million bonds, which were subscribed twice over for targeting SDG-related outcomes and used for procuring vaccines during the pandemic and offering scholarships to disadvantaged students. What we need now is to accelerate this kind of transformative funding. By sharing your experiences in today's discussion, we will help generate creative solutions for the future. The UN and Thailand looks forward to working with you all as the country embarks on the sustainable and green journey with transformative results. Thank you very much and happy.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kita, United Nations Resident Coordinator in Thailand, for welcoming the participants and for the relentless support the UN has provided Thailand and working toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Ladies and gentlemen, before moving on to the first session, I would like to invite all dignitaries who have been welcoming the participants and all speakers to kindly remain on your camera for a group photo, please. So please look collectively at the camera as I started counting 1, 2, 3 and hold your position for a perfect and beautiful capture. Ready? 1, 2, and 3. Very perfect and beautiful picture. Thank you very much for the generous cooperation and a meaningful group photo opportunity. So moving on, we shall begin with the first presentation on stewardship, voting and engagement practices by Ms. Bonnie Groves, Specialist, Stewardship Principal for Responsible Investment, and Ms. Valerie Kwan, Director, Engagement Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. Allow me to give a reminder that if any of you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box and we'll get them back at the Q&A session. Ms. Bonnie Groves, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Palmy, and thank you for the organisation for having me today. So I will talk through the best practice that Principles for Responsible Investment has around engagement, voting and collaboration. So I'm looking forward to talking you through that and hopefully bringing it to life with some key examples. So moving on to the first slide, we already did have a brief introduction. There we go, to the Principles for Responsible Investment. But just to highlight that we are leading organisation on responsible investment, working to ultimately serve the long-term interests of the environment and society as a whole, but working with our signatories. So all of the best practice that I'll talk to today has really been co-developed with our investor signatories. We have about over 5,300 now, so I'm sure some of you are in the audience. But moving on to the next slide, the principles for responsible investment are made up of 6 principles, as is in the name. So it's principle 2 that you can see circled here on the slide that we'll really be focusing on today. This is the commitment by our investor members to be active owners and to incorporate ESG issues into their ownership policies and practices. So as already highlighted by the introductory remarks, clear overlaps with this call to action with the I Code, and incredibly necessary if we are to achieve a sustainable financial system that we're looking for. So moving on to the next slide, I'm just going to start with an introduction just so that we're all on the same page. So how the Principles for Responsible Investment defines stewardship is through the use of influence by institutional investors to maximize overall long-term value, including the value of common economic, social and environmental assets, on which returns on clients' and beneficiaries' interests depend. So probably a definition everyone's quite familiar with, but this is just what we'll be coming back to as we talk through effective stewardship in the next 15 or so minutes. So on the next slide, you can see the kind of 2 pillars of what we mean when we're talking about stewardship and how investors can fulfill their stewardship actions. It should be showing one pillar with the examples of investee stewardship that investors can choose from to undertake effective stewardship, and then on the other side, broader stewardship. So by investee stewardship, we're looking at engagement, voting, the filing of shareholder proposals, board and committee roles, and direct oversight of assets. And also something we're increasingly seeing investors do is litigation. On the broader stewardship side, we're looking at policy engagement, engagement with standard setters, industry groups and other stakeholders, and engagement with actors across the investment chain. So how can you influence the operating environment? So going beyond just direct influence of your investee companies. And then finally, in that broader stewardship category is what can you do to contribute to public goods or public discourse? Are there public statements you can make to shape the political landscape that you operate in, or are there pieces of research that you can publish to help move the needle in the right direction? So on the next slide, we will start, and we can actually skip this slide onto the next slide again. Again, just a quick definition. Again, for the Principles for Responsible Investment, when we talk about engagement, we have a specific focus on ESG practices, sustainability outcomes, or public disclosure. So what we're not talking about when we're talking about engagement are those day-to-day conversations with a company, unless there is the intent to achieve an ESG outcome or improvement. And for us, the benefits of engagement are to make sure that you have a better understanding of your companies, and that the company also has a better understanding of you and your expectations. It helps improve the disclosures of a company, the ESG disclosures, how they manage their ESG risks, and also ultimately helps mitigate financial risks, and also contributes to maximizing positive sustainability outcomes, including those linked to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So on the next slide, moving to the real content of this presentation around what does best practice look like around developing an engagement process. So the first important step for developing any engagement process is that developing a dedicated stewardship policy. So this stewardship policy should be consistent with local regulation, stewardship codes, and the 6 principles for responsible investments. It needs to be aligned with your organization's investment strategy. And as part of that, we do encourage people to review your stewardship policy regularly to make sure it's both up to date with external best practice, but also any changes that you have internally around your ambition, and also to feed in any learnings or insights you have as you go through the engagement process. So the policy should include what is the scope of the policy, what are the assets that are covered by the policy. This should be really clearly highlighted. It should also include the organization's stewardship objectives, the stewardship tools that you will use as an organization, and the role of collaboration within this, but also very practically how inside information and conflicts of interest are managed, and how these stewardship activities are linked to the wider investment decision making. So the stewardship policy can also include information on how you make your voting decisions, but some organizations will also choose to have a separate voting policy. So that's a decision that you can make. And on the side of the slide there, you can see there are 4 PRI resources that can give some quite practical insights into how to go about creating these policies and what best practices around engagement, including insights from our signatories already. Once you've developed your stewardship policies, the next step is around making sure you've defined your priorities. You've got some clear objectives and milestones as well, so that you can really track the development and the results of your stewardship policies. And something that I'll kind of come back to a few times this presentation is around the disclosure element. We really encourage investors to report on their engagement activities, on the outcomes, and also on the learnings from these activities, not only for any beneficiaries and clients, but also to share these with other investors. It also helps companies see what kind of topics investors are looking at, so that can help encourage a company to start on the front foot of any topic in anticipation that their investors will come to talk to them about it. Some of the key elements of a successful engagement strategy are really the preparation ahead of talking to a company, and making sure that you're able to provide clear feedback, but also positive feedback as well. A really clear aspect as you enter a conversation with a company is making sure that you can demonstrate a really holistic understanding of the company's performance and the strategy. This includes being able to understand the corporate culture and to be able to navigate any cultural differences between yourselves and the company, and to be sensitive to these. Part of this holistic understanding of a corporate culture is getting a range of data points. So this can include not just research and engaging with the company management, but also getting on the ground and undertaking activities such as visiting site operations to really get that whole picture of how a company is performing and what their sustainability impacts might be, in a way that you might not get from a company report, for example. A really key part of the success of an engagement will be building up the trust and rapport with the company. So building relationships across the company's different levels, with a recognition that this is a long-term relationship and a conversation that you will have over multiple years. And then just some practicalities around aligning your request with international standards where possible, and timing your requests strategically and appropriately. So whether that's related to the company's financial year, but also to any external milestones that might make your ask more relevant or make your ask land better. And then part of that disclosure piece is sharing best practices. Are there any learnings that you have from how other companies might have gone about something that you could share with this company? Or are there ways you can bring companies together who might be struggling with the same issue? So this real kind of disclosure element. And in terms of reporting, we recommend that investors report on a regular basis, whether that is quarterly or annually. But this is something that we really strongly emphasize, and we really see that this information needs to be easily accessible and easy to understand. So on the next slide, I'll just whiz through this. We asked our signatories as part of the reporting and assessment process in 2021 how they prioritize engagements. And the first two priorities were very aligned globally, but the third reason that signatories gave for how they prioritize engagements slightly diverged. Our global results said that signatories prioritize engagements based on specific ESG factors with systemic influence, such as climate or human rights. But our 2021 results found that signatories from Asia, excluding Japan, prioritized engagements based on the ESG rating of the entity. So we will have updated data at the end of the year, but I thought that was interesting, particularly in relation to the next slide, which is PRI's evolution of stewardship and engagement. So we asked ourselves the question, how can investors better deliver against beneficiaries' interests and improve the sustainability and resilience of the financial system? So we understood that too much focus on addressing risk at that individual asset level and a short-term focus can actually undermine long-term investment performance, but it also doesn't solve these systemic risks such as climate change or human rights, and you can't divest away from these risks. So this is one of the challenges that we work through with our signatories, and this is how we came to our structure Active Ownership 2.0. So this is the evolution of stewardship, where we see in Active Ownership 2.0 investors directly seeking outcomes on systemic issues and common goals. So on the next slide, you'll see that investors can do this through their direct stewardship, through collaboration, whether that's collaborative engagement or joint research, for example, and also the broader stewardship, so engaging with policy, standard setters, etc., as I spoke about earlier. Focusing on that middle section, collaboration, on the next slide, we just have a few points around what the benefits of collaboration can be. So this is when a group of institutional investors come together to engage in dialogue with companies or other stakeholders. So the first element is around building knowledge and skills. If you're working to engage companies with other investors, you'll be able to share your best practice and your perspective, but also draw on others and gain the expertise of other organizations. And with this collaboration, you may not just be working with investors, you can also include NGOs, think tank, any other local players as well. So you can really get this range of insights here. And if you have that shared understanding of an issue, it can really lead itself to efficiency. So you can avoid the duplication of efforts, conversations, you can channel your concerns in a consistent and systematic way. You also can share costs, for example, any costs of research, the practical costs of engaging with a company, the flights, the resources, also sharing the responsibility of having to manage all of these engagements. And again, by sharing expertise, you can delegate different engagement aspects to different people within your collaboration. And this especially really helps at smaller and resource-constrained investors who can lend their names to a collaboration and the shares, but they may not have had the ability to resource a whole collaboration themselves. And with that lending of names and shares, this really plays into the enhanced power and legitimacy. You increase the weight of your demands in the eyes of corporate management, and it's very much harder for the company to ignore any of your asks if you're a group of investors rather than just one. Moving on to a practical example then to just bring this to life. PRI ran a 10-year collaboration on working with investors to engage on sustainable palm oil, that there was real innovation or a lot of changing in the different approaches throughout the years, recognizing which different stakeholders would be influential within the system, whether that's engaging with banking sector or opening up the collaboration to a wider industry. But I will just highlight at the bottom of the slide, you can see the source and the engagement results. So there's a lot more information there about the different approaches taken and also the successes that came out of this collaboration. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll go through our approach to voting and we can skip on to the next slide again. So one thing I think to highlight around voting is that while engaging with companies has a lot of richness, flexibility, you learn a lot, there are all the benefits that we spoke about earlier, it can also introduce ambiguity if you have a lot of investors engaging in private engagements, individually and via collaborations. They may have slightly different asks, slightly different viewpoints, and something that a company can do as a result of this is to exploit some of these minor differences to either reduce the scrutiny on them, choose the easier ask from a company, and to avoid taking as much action as an investor might want. So a shareholder proposal is a really important corporate engagement mechanism, and this allows investors to use their formal rights to engage a company in a transparent way, and also to get that interaction to the company board, as sometimes it can be quite hard to access that level of seniority. So it focuses this effort on a single concrete call to action, and it's very transparent. Once you have that aggregate result of investor support for shareholder resolution, the beneficiaries can see that, and the company can also see on aggregate what do their shareholders think on a topic, and that can be harder to ignore. So on the next slide, we have PRI's resource here around making voting count, where we put forward voting principles. We encourage investors to put forward high-level principles that govern their investor decisions. And so I'll just skip to the next slide. The way that investors can apply these principles is that rather than seeing the vote for a shareholder resolution as a form of escalation or a vote against a company, we really put forward that by using your voting principles, you could vote on a shareholder resolution as a vote for your own principles. And this means that you can inform companies of your positions on topics. You can affirm a company's direction on a topic by voting for a shareholder resolution, and it shouldn't be seen again as a form of escalation. I will skip the next slide because this really just highlights this point that PRI does not see shareholder resolutions as a form of escalation. And the next slide is just some insights that we have from emerging themes in 2023 AGM season. But I think that Valerie will probably cover much more focus area on climate and AGMs. So again, in this next slide is just to bring it all together and highlight that, of course, everything is connected between engagement, voting, and investment decisions. And the disclosure element around your stewardship policy and your engagements also applies to voting decisions. So we really encourage investors to disclose their pre a vote on what their voting intention is, and also after a vote on how they voted. So just a very brief summary on the next slide is that stewardship can be delivered across all asset classes. Collaboration is really, really key, and a clear escalation strategy is very important, but that voting is not a form of escalation. There are, of course, so many different tools, and AGM season is a key one of those. And I'll hand over now to Valerie.
Very well said. I will take this on then to the next part of the presentation. Hi, everyone. My name is Valerie Kwan. I'm the Director of Engagement at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. Just a bit of a housekeeping issue here. You'll notice two versions of our logo at AIGCC. I apologize if there are any confusion. Just so you're aware, this is the AIGCC slides template. We're just sort of in the process of switching between branding. So, but I don't see how that would affect our content in any way for today. But coming back to the content and also following Bonnie's presentation just now, I'd just like to offer a view through the insights that we've gathered from investors on how they undertake stewardship with a focus on climate change and climate-related risks. So whilst we're on this slide, so I will just maybe start off with a bit of an intro to AIGCC. Promise it's only 2 slides. Yeah, stay on to this slide if we can, please. Just so you understand sort of the objectives of our organization, and so you'll be able to understand or identify where our work might be relevant. So AIGCC is an initiative to create awareness and encourage action amongst the Asia's asset owners and financial institutions about the risks and opportunities associated with climate change and low carbon investing. So we are a membership organization, and since 2016 have recruited over 73 73 institutional investors across 11 Asian markets. So to date, our accumulated assets under management within the membership would be around 32 trillions of US dollars. So we offer for our members numerous opportunities to learn from each other. We have a series of different events and we use ourselves as a platform. We have a working group structure, different themes which are being covered. And so you can sign on to those and be involved in the relevant conversations. So I won't go into too much detail today. I don't think today is the forum, but just if you're interested, please reach out. And we also offer for our members on-demand training on climate change, and also C-Suite Roundtable, which is an annual event now. And also you'll be invited to fill in sort of annual net zero investment surveys, because we will need to use those as the results to map the developing trends in Asia for net zero investment. So on the next slide, if you may, thank you, would be that we've established relationships with within the Asian investor ecosystem, and that would include influential asset owners, sovereign wealth funds, and pension funds. All of these are members or potential members to whom we aim to share our vision and mission with. So you'll see on the slide here, we have a vision of creating a climate resilient economy on track by 2030 for a net zero emissions global economy by 2050. So the way for us to go about this is for us to connect, collaborate, and to advocate for and on behalf of our member investors to accelerate progress and action on climate change, for them to responsibly manage long-term risks and opportunities, and to drive sustainable returns for investors and beneficiaries that they represent across diverse markets in Asia. So what this really means is that clearly Asia has a clear role to play in the global pathway towards net zero by 2050, and it will take all parties to do their part for us to achieve this. And so in today's presentation, I'll be focusing on the how we can materialize this into actions through investors' engagement with companies. So if we go on to the next slide, please, that's all for AIGCC intros. But then in here, I'd like to start and see that, see to it that we really want to build confidence within investors so that they will be able to conduct effective, robust, and impactful engagement in Asia. And so to start with, we do acknowledge that investors in Asia typically will face quite different challenges, but the opportunities from within corporate engagement on climate is also unique there. And so one cannot disregard the level of diversity that there are when we talk about different Asian markets. And I think the audience here will only know too well. So I think the implications of different regulatory landscapes will also have a factor to play in here as well. So for that reason, when we think about sort of the different market specificities in Asia, and when you sort of go through today's presentation, as I go through today's presentation, I would encourage you to also add an additional layer of analysis of your own with your experience in engaging with the Thai companies, so that you can sort of identify how that might be unique for your situation in Thailand. So with that as a starting point, I think so in the slide you'll see sort of listed a couple of methodologies that we can refer to. So I think if we delve into these references to see how they can support engagement on climate, these listed in the slide are the ones that I would recommend in addition to the great sort of guidelines that Bonnie had referred to, because these also offer great detail on climate in particular. And if you wish to engage with companies from a specific sector, some of these would give guidance to that effect as well. So in particular, the first one there, Climate Action 100+ Net Zero Company Benchmark, the disclosure framework in particular, you can consider that a tool to assess the company's robustness in its disclosure of their ambition levels, targets on climate and strategic priorities, including their sort of board oversight on climate, their strategies on decarbonization and capital allocation and just transition and so on. So these are all quite sort of, these are all the underlying indicators from within the benchmark. You can also look into the TPI Management Quality and Carbon Performance tool. It looks at a wider universe of companies, so beyond the CA100 Plus list of companies, and it will assess the readiness by management to set and achieve climate goals, and whether the targets that are being set and disclosed by companies are aligned with what's required in the remaining carbon budget. So with some of these tools, investors may choose to inform their voting and lend their support behind some of the shareholder proposals with reference to the assessments that are outlined in the slide there. I think ultimately we do understand that in Asia, the regional decarbonization aspect and the detail as it becomes available for different countries to identify how sort of their role plays out in the regional energy roadmaps, how of that, all of that needs to be taken into consideration in the transition to net zero. And I think these, again, would be useful references to complement with your own analysis at a market level. So for the rest of the presentation today, I will be focusing on elements from two main reports, which I'll be referring to. And so I'll be offering you the absolute essence from each of these reports. So if we go on to the next slide, please, I'll start off with this one, which is a Climate Action 100 Plus Investor Guide for Engaging in Asia. We've published this last year. We are also looking to sort of refresh this over time as well as more information becomes available. The main thing that this guide does is that it recognizes that companies are at different stages of transition, and based on their transition journey, we sort of, through the guide, give some references on what priorities to engage on. So if you look into this guide and you map that against the net zero company benchmark that I've just introduced earlier on, you'll see that they are complementary. The benchmark itself is sector and market agnostic. And so this investor guide, what we try to do is to translate some of the engagement asks for emerging markets and for companies to take smaller but steady steps ahead, so that we can also acknowledge the progress that's being made. So I'd encourage you to go into this guide and go and have a look for yourself. The topics that we look into would also, as you can imagine, cover things like corporate net zero commitments, what the interim targets and decarbonization strategies look like. So we'll have some examples in there. And then whether the company has a relevant management system in place to oversee that. So I think within each of these categories, you'll see some case studies from Asia. And the point we do try to make a point there to give as many examples as possible to see that where an alignment with the benchmark could happen or where it needs to be a staggered process. So on the next slide, please. This is sort of maybe of most interest to people because these are the investor feedback that we have extracted directly through interviews as part of the report. So in the report, you'll see these interview quotes in the report. And we're able to characterize some of the key features that investors provided feedback on in terms of how they define a successful engagement to look like. Now, first of all, we want to ensure that there is effectiveness of engagement through the ability to maintain an open dialogue. So that means that when we talk about leveling up the profile of the engagement, we can think of that from the terms of also the level of seniority of both the investors and the corporate on both ends. This seems to be a particularly relevant point in Asia, such that sort of the conversation sort of goes into higher and higher levels on both ends at the same time. And we also take note that in state-owned enterprise, which also form a large part of the list of companies in CA100+, there are a specific set of priorities that we need to be aware of. And throughout the engagement process, the importance to keep the engagement asks robust and purposeful. So one way about to do that is to anchor the specific asks that investors have of the company to reference to the benchmark so that it's clear and purposeful. And so that's also when you might want to complement that with different stewardship tools like proxy voting, like shareholder resolution, or any form of tools that might be relevant. Put it on the table as part of the dialogue with the company to make that a robust and purposeful conversation. And also investors also reflected that maybe we should be maximizing the level of impact through engagement by collaborations. And that's sort of really the gist of how Climate Action 100 Plus works, taking sort of the collaboration between local and international investors together as part of the core, the underpinning pillars of work for the initiative. So I think we've sort of thrown in a few different possible combinations of how engagement could look like. I think one key thing that I would always emphasize is that there is no one-size-fit-all mechanism where you could just replicate for every engagement, because the dynamics for different engagements might be different, and so would be the different complementary tools. Often it would mean that we will need to deploy a multi-pronged approach, use different tools in tandem or sort of in a particular sequence or by different investors so that they can work together in an engagement. So on the next slide, please. So key considerations. I think ultimately for us to identify the appropriate engagement approach, what we'll also need to consider is to understand the company's influence along the value chain in its commitment to decarbonization. So there could be different stewardship practices, which would mean that there would be, filing shareholder resolutions, for example, would be considered a bit more of a novelty in most Asian markets, to be completely frank. And then the ability for us to keep that dialogue open and to use also voting tools in complementary, as in, for example, utilizing the existing management proposals, vote in a particular manner to raise sort of the key concerns that investors may have. Those are all tools that we should also consider. And ultimately, I think it's always a case of constantly testing the methods and then recalibrating them as we use them as engagement tactics. Some of that I think Bonnie had mentioned to an extent already in a different sort of, in a very comprehensive manner as well. So I think all in all, we just have to reiterate that all of these considerations or options or tools are available. We just have to weigh them and then make a decision as to if and when tabling different kinds of engagement approaches is useful to the engagement. And then we sort of include supporting of shareholder proposals on climate change and have investors have a clear climate voting guideline to guide them through how they would vote in the case for different companies. So with that, I think it would be useful for me to bring on the next slide, which would be an introduction to another report, which we've launched together with Client Earth last year. The report Net Zero Engagement in Asia is a guide to shareholder climate resolutions. And it is, we see it as a resource for Asia-focused investors to look into shareholder resolutions, because it can complement the broader engagement options when investors exercise responsible stewardship on climate matters. When you go through the guide, you will find sort of showcases of views from local experts from across 11 Asian jurisdictions. And you will find the detail from within, where you can also see sort of the guidance for Thailand, for example. But also just to note that these are high-level references, and please do not consider them as legal advice for a specific case. But if we go on to the next slide, I will comment on some of the commonly discussed sort of definitions, such as what exactly is a climate shareholder resolution. So in here, we define them as shareholder filed resolution, which concern a company's governance, disclosure, or business strategy. So these are, non-exhaustive examples, but typically in this case in particular, we focus that around climate change, and we sort of see to it that it complements other options as well. But we also look at different types of themes, such as, has the company set an ambition or have made a commitment on a net zero business in their scope 1 to 3 greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 by the latest, for example? Or it could be a resolution on the development of the company of a Paris-aligned strategy or to see to it that they have a transition plan with short, medium, and long-term goals. We've seen plenty of them in the region as well, and we can go into a bit more detail in just a few moments. We can also see some examples of shareholders using that as an opportunity to approve or vote down the terms or the implementation of the company's Paris-aligned strategy or transition plan. And we also sometimes see an example of, again, a live example later on that I can share on the disclosure of the company's details on their climate or energy policy lobbying, advertising or advocacy activities. So if we go on to the next slide, I'll just very quickly run through the questions that that are covered in the guide. And you can go, you're strongly encouraged to go into the details to see what all of these entail for the market in Thailand, for example. But typically the questions that needs to be asked would be, is there a basic right to file by investors? Meaning, do shareholders have the basic right to propose a shareholder climate resolution to start with? Do we need to amend the charter documents, or are they a recommendation, or is it a requirement for the amendments to happen? What types of shareholder resolutions are even available, and what are the voting thresholds? What we mean here in particular is sort of the applicable types of shareholder resolutions in the said jurisdiction. It could be, there are many different kinds. There are ordinary resolutions, special shareholder resolutions, advisory or non-binding ones. So we need to identify what are the ones that are applicable for the market, and then to understand by an extension, what level of votes are required for such kinds of resolution to pass. There are also other questions like what thresholds are there for filing the resolution for a meeting, the process and formal requirements for doing so, how the company needs to respond and the cost-bearing element of it, and whether it can, as in the resolution, can be withdrawn. It means that sometimes shareholders can withdraw a resolution after it's been filed. In some jurisdictions, they actually use this as a tactic because the withdrawal period could happen anytime prior to the meeting or at the meeting. So lots of questions that people can think about. If you go into the report itself on page 87, you'll see the dedicated chapter on Thailand, and you'll sort of find the answers to all of the questions that were raised just now in here. But I think a couple of things are quite clear, and that is there is a great work that's happening in the market here in terms of promoting the awareness for companies to incorporate climate-related risks into strategic planning and risk management. And I think those are great indications of the momentum that's picking up on this end. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So this would be almost my last slide on the shareholder resolution side of discussion before we jump into case studies. But then just to be brief, this is a snapshot of the climate resolutions that we've seen in Asia over the past few years up until 2022. We've already had the 2023 AGM season, but I'll present them as cases instead. But just to articulate the trend that's been happening, in the first 2 years, 2020 and 2021, all of these, as you'll see, are in the Japan market. We're talking about resolutions that are NGO-led, and so they are typically focused on the company strategy and their alignment with Paris. So I've sort of mentioned that earlier on, being one of the main themes that's covered. But in 2022, last year, what we've seen is, and also that's groundbreaking development, the first substantial institutional investor-backed resolution for the case of J-Power. So it's no longer sort of NGO-led only kind of attempt. And what we see is that investors involved in that process are investors like Amundi, HSBC Asset Management, and Man Group. So if you sort of look that up, you'll see quite plenty of coverage about these resolutions. And I think the successful lodging of this climate shareholder resolution signals that investors do have concern over the company's climate risks, and that they are sort of actively using this as a tool to demonstrate their concern. So if we go on to the next slide. So here are some case studies. So I'll just stick with the Japanese market for a moment here. On the left, you will see the first flagged resolution that we have seen in Climate Action 100 Plus for the case of Toyota, with a focus on the lobbying activities, which was perceived to be a misalignment with the Paris Agreement. So if you follow the link for the 2023 flagged votes link, which will bring you to the website, you'll see a full list of the flagged resolutions for the entire proxy season. And again, this simply signals how engagement can be brought to a more public profile, and it is quite impactful as a result. And the proposals that are being put forward by the investors, again, signal the concern that they have with the company's climate performance. And therefore, they would put a proposal forward asking for the company to improve in a specific area. So in other regions, there had been also numerous examples of proposals that are put forward. And then I've mentioned before, sort of using withdrawal as somewhat of a tactic as well. That ultimately can also be considered an effective tool. But in Asia, this is all quite nascent, so we're not able to share an abundance of examples just yet. But I'm happy to share that we do have one that's being flagged on our website in this AGM season. Now, I've talked a lot about shareholder resolutions, but that also brings us to the question of what are the other tools we've been talking about, using tools in complementary, using sort of double-pronged approaches. The other tools that we can also consider, in addition to shareholder resolution, would be the case of KEPCO, which you'll see also on this slide that I'm keen to share. So in here, you'll actually see not one, but two KEPCO case studies. The first one is the actual spread, which is the case study that we've put into our report in 2020. 2020 was a very momentous year. It's been very eventful. At the start of the year, we've already had investors consistently voicing their concern on KEPCO's coal power projects that were still underway at that point. And then they've also done so very publicly through media, all of which were cited in different papers in Korea and internationally as well. So in 2020, intense discussions, media profile, all of that coming together created the opportunity for the investors to also additionally write a public letter to the Ministry of Economy and Finance in Korea. So this is MOEF is KEPCO's largest shareholder, and so soon after that we see momentum picking up. The Korean government committing to net zero by 2050. Plans to close out coal power plants by 2034. So a lot of momentum has picked up since then. And I think this development would mean that in Asian markets, policy engagement and corporate engagement will need to sometimes go hand in hand again as well. And in this KEPCO case, you'll see I said there's not one, but two. In 2021, we updated with an additional update on the developments with KEPCO, being another public statement written to the Presidential Office of Carbon Neutrality, where following that, KEPCO announced that they will commit to carbon neutrality by 2050. So all of these are quite encouraging developments that we've seen as a different type of engagement mechanism as well. So on the next slide, I'll bring on just very briefly another example where we have Hon Hai Precision, also a CA100 Plus company, where they have through engagements with the investors within the initiative, committing to a explicit commitment to a net zero emissions by 2050 with the specific expectations that were agreed upon between the investor team and the company. So with this, it sort of raises the profile of the commitments that the company has made, which is very well received. And it also has opened up the dialogue for us to have deeper conversations on the company's business strategies. You might not see it here because at the point of writing up the case study, that is sort of still in development, but following that, Hon Hai Precision has also significantly developed their business towards a different emerging model as they envisioned their own role in the growing EV trend. So that's another example for you. And finally, in the next slide, please, I'd just like to end with this one because bringing this home, definitely we'll need to mention PTT because this is the one Thai company that we also have in CA100 Plus. This case study in particular is featured in our inaugural annual report all the way back in 2019. So the initiative has been around for 5 years and in fact has already started phase 2. So this is the very first report that we've issued at inception. And considering the context at that time, when in 2019, that was before the wave of net zero pledges, at that point, we've already acknowledged that PTT was quite in the front runner in terms of publication of a TCFD aligned report, which was good. But subsequently, we do see more commitments in terms of CapEx, their carbon neutrality goals, and all of that. And also the divestments in coal assets that were committed earlier this year. All of these are good developments. So I just want to give a sort of a mention in here as well, given the audience. But I think with that, on the next slide, I would just end offering people to look at, other publications that we have. If you would like to sort of know more about our work, some of these reports are co-authored by our investors as well, but I'll just leave it at that. And draw my particular presentation to a close there on the next slide. And I think I'll just hand back to you, Bonnie. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I think brought to life a lot of the things we touched on, or I touched on. I will very quickly just whiz through what PRI's program on stewardship is. So on the 2 slides, yep, the next slide from here, brilliant. So we've already spoken about Climate Action 100 Plus, but PRI leads a few other collaborative stewardship initiatives as well. So we've got Advance, which focuses on human rights and social issues. This was launched last year. We also have recently launched a pilot collaborative engagement, sovereign engagement on climate change, starting in Australia, but I think it'll be really interesting to see how this engagement works. So definitely look out for that, and we'll share learnings throughout this engagement as well. And then we have a collaborative engagement on nature, where we have just closed our call for the advisory groups. So we'll be starting to publish our objectives and milestones around that shortly as well. We also have supported initiatives, and you can see the investor policy dialogue on deforestation there, which actually was one of the outcomes from the palm oil collaborative engagement. And then at the bottom, you can see that we also support investors in other ways. So on the next slide, the PRI has the collaboration platform, which is a publicly accessible platform that facilitates investors to share opportunities to join a collaboration or an initiative, and also where you can see what other investors are working on and opportunities for you to join. So it's really to help overcome that barrier where you might not know what other investors are working on, what opportunities there are to collaborate on. So I really want to emphasize that this is a public tool. Anyone can register to the collaboration platform, but signatories to the PRI can create collaborations on it. And then the other tool that we have on the next slide is the resolution database. Again, this is a public tool, and we gather as globally and as comprehensively as possible ESG related resolutions, management proposals, and director elections and re-elections. So you can add a vote to the resolution database, but you can also use it as a resource as we try and compile it as much as possible. We've paired it to Climate Action 100 Plus, for example. So the votes that they flag throughout proxy season, investors can pre-declare their voting intention using the resolution database. So it's a good place to also see any focus areas of investors as well. And you can see at the top that signatories to the PRI can sign up to the resolution alert, which is a newsletter we send throughout proxy season. And we also have a collaboration alert highlighting ongoing and new opportunities to collaborate. Again, just to highlight these opportunities for you as you look to see the different topics that you want to engage on. So the next slide is just PRI's resources, so I'll let you look at those in the slides that are sent to you. There's quite a few there. And just to wrap up and say thank you very much for joining and for listening. You've got some contact details on the final slide for the collaborations email, and also to our info and James, who will be your point of contact if you have any questions around our resources and our collaborative engagements. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing the Q&A next. And yeah, if you have any questions, do submit them in the chat, and we'll both be around to answer those.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Bonnie Graves from PRI and Ms. Valerie Kwan from AIGCC for your remarkable presentation of stewardship, voting and engagement practices, ladies and gentlemen. And that's a wrap for our first wonderful presentation, and very insightful as well. Thank you very much. And next on the agenda, we would like to take all of you to the investor panel discussion on engagement and climate change, and also Q&A session where we're deeply honored to have Ms. Ayago Nomizu, Senior Specialist Climate Action 100 Plus from PRI, as a moderator to the Q&A session. There'll also be a time at the end if any participants wish to ask any questions to the speaker, and we'll take all questions at the end. Okay, so in this session, we're honored to have several speakers today who have extensive expertise on the topic, including Ms. Valerie Kwan, Director Engagement, Asia Investor Group on Climate Change, AIGCC, Ms. Ali Chen, Sustainable Investing Associate from Fidelity International, Ms. Corinne Peng, Regional Head of Equities Research and Stewardship from AIA Group, AIA Investment Management, and Ms. NC Wang, Senior Manager from Responsible Investment Prudential PLC. I'll now pass the floor to our moderator, Ms. Ayago Nomizu, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Ayago Nomizu from the PRI, and I have the honor of moderating today's panel. So in the first session, Bonnie talked about fundamentals and best practices of effective stewardship, and Valerie also talked about stewardship practices focusing on climate. So in our panel, I'd like to explore how all these things we just heard are put into practice. Valerie will stay on the panel, and we will also have three distinguished investor speakers, Ali, Corinne, and NC. So to start, I have asked the three investors to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their organization's stewardship strategy and approach, and climate commitments, if there are any. So may I ask Ali to kick off this introduction? Over to you, Ali.
Thank you. Sawadika, thank you for having me today. So at Fidelity, I'll just go straight into the stewardship strategy at Fidelity. So stewardship is a key component of how we incorporate climate consideration into our investment. But the key is, how do we conduct these stewardships? And we do it by doing it holistically, by engaging multiple stakeholders in different manners. So echoing Valerie's point about, there's no one-size-fits-all strategy, let me quickly outline who are these stakeholders and how we actually engage with them. Let's visualize different stakeholders into different layers of circles, and I'll group them into three layers. So starting with the core circle, we are referring to the companies. And with this group of stakeholders, we are actually having direct one-on-one engagement with them. We also join PRI or AIGCC to have collaborative engagement with them. We also exercise our voting rights at the AGMs. And if we expand the circle to the next layer, we're referring to the industry players. And with this group of stakeholders, we're sharing our expertise on climate actions, for instance. And the way we do it is by participating in global and regional initiatives such as Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. And we look at the next layer, the outer layer. We're talking about policymakers, regulators, and international standard setters. So with this group of stakeholders, we engage with them differently as well. So we have dialogues with them. We also respond to the consultations. And outside of these circles of stakeholders, we are also focusing on the individuals. And what we mean is we're referring to Fidelity employees as well as clients. And we have multiple trainings and calls or meetings with them to talk about ESG or sustainability. And also we will cater, we'll actually customize the training for our clients. And our clients include institutional clients, asset owners or banks. And with regard to our climate commitment, starting from 2030, we aim to reduce 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions in our investment portfolio by 50%. And in the next 10 years, by 2040, we aim to phase out our exposure to thermal coal globally. And in another 10 years, by 2050, we aim to achieve net zero for our investment portfolios. And now let me hand over to Corinne to tell us more about AIA's stewardship strategy.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you, Ayasan. Sawadika to all of you as well, and thanks for inviting me. So a bit about myself, I head the equity research team at AIA and recently expanded my role to lead our stewardship efforts across the asset classes. At AIA, we have committed to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 and to use the Science-Based Targets Initiative methodology to set our emissions reduction targets. And this year, we're onboarding 2 specialized stewardship analysts to strengthen our team. But having said that, at AIA, stewardship and ESG are not just the responsibility of a few of us. This is deeply embedded into our day-to-day investment research and portfolio management process by our investment team based on the ground across Asia, including Thailand. In fact, quite a number of our Thai colleagues are online today attending this webinar right now. So hello. So I'll now hand over to NC.
Thank you, Corinne. Sawadika, everyone. This is NC from Prudential. So we are a life insurer and asset owner with 175 years of company history, and we've been operating in Thailand since 1995. And in terms of my current role at Prudential, I'm supporting the development of responsible investment policies and strategies at a group level for all the markets and asset classes. We're often told by others that Prudential can be a unique animal, and the reason being we now have a business footprint exclusively in Asia and Africa. But at the same time, due to our strong UK legacy, we also have developed extensive stakeholder relationship and gained strong expectations from the development markets. So this has created a very unique business dynamic for us to pursue both the globally leading RI initiatives when it comes to stewardship, but also having a genuine interest in tackling the challenges from emerging and frontier markets. Therefore, I think the topic around climate is a key agenda driven by our board at the group level, but cascades down to all the emerging markets. In addition, we have publicly announced to achieve net zero portfolio-wise by 2050, and looking forward to share more about that approach and what it means in terms of stewardship. So looking forward to the discussion. Back to you, Ayasan.
Thank you very much for that introduction. So that was a great introduction, and I'd like to sort of drill it down to the the stewardship related to climate. So I'd like to ask all the investors how, we started talking about it a little bit, but how you incorporate climate change into your stewardship activities a little bit more. So Corinne, can I ask you to go first on this one?
Sure. So the bulk of AIA's greenhouse emissions are actually scope 3 in nature, sitting in the investment book. So we have a considerable challenge in terms of emission reduction efforts in the coming years. Therefore, it's really important for us to actively engage our investee companies on climate change and environmental related risks in our regular discussions. And this will align us in our net zero and ESG related objectives in this long journey together. I think the good thing for us is that we're long-term investors. And for many of our portfolio holdings, we have been shareholders for many years, some as early as pre-IPO days. So we have over the years built very strong, solid relationships and communication channels with our investee companies, meeting them at least twice a year, if not once every quarter. And about 2 years ago, we enhanced our ESG assessment methodology for our fixed income and listed equity issuers under our research coverage. So essentially, we developed a more quantitative approach by creating our proprietary ESG rating scorecard that's been externally validated as fit for purpose together with our fixed income team. And in our scorecard, it includes 8 themes and 34 ESG metrics under the ESG pillar, with a strong emphasis on environmental considerations, such as emissions intensity, waste treatment, water stress, natural capital recycling. And the assess the issuers we have are then scored on a 5-grade scale from A to E. So this essentially provides our 72 equity and credit research analysts based on the ground in 12 markets, including Thailand, with a common framework and metrics to evaluate all our investee companies' approach and activities to tackle climate change and how their practices and performance stack up against their peers operating in the same industry. So if you look further, we also evaluate whether the company's transition pathways are on an improving, stagnating, or deteriorating trend. And this review is repeated at least once a year, or whenever there are material climate or other ESG-related developments that could impact our investee companies. In addition, we also conduct thematic engagements periodically and have included climate change among the topics that we have surveyed our over 1,000 investee companies under research coverage. And we then provide high-level insights resulting from our thematic engagements in our annual ESG report.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Nancy, can I hear from you on this point as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of climate approach, one key distinction to make at the very beginning is that we are an asset owner. Therefore, our engagement with the investee companies is mainly implemented by our underlying asset managers. But what this means to us is that it's really important to highlight and communicate to them what are the most important metrics and considerations. And for us, I think the success in climate stewardship is dependent on 2 key factors, which are number 1, the local context, and number 2, the sectoral materiality. So speaking of local context, our stewardship team would make an intentional effort in learning about the regional macro policy environment and the national climate roadmap before diving into or initiating any dialogue. And where possible, we aim to use local teams to remove any of the language or cultural barriers that may happen in a physical meeting. And speaking of the sectoral materiality, we have a cross-functional task force to formulate the different sectoral approaches in order to inform what are the investment decisions and engagement when it comes to climate change. So as a first phase, as we are rolling out this working group, we have prioritized some of the key sectors that are most material from a climate mitigation perspective, such as utilities. And based on this deeper dive analysis, we will focus on developing a list of sector-specific engagement questions so that the engagement response are more targeted, and ultimately this will drive the decarbonization progress.
Thank you, Nancy. Ali, can I ask you to comment as well?
Sure. So at Fidelity, we have a range of stewardship strategies that we deploy at different levels. But here I'll just highlight 3 key tools and 1 key process that are interconnected. So number 1 is climate rating. Number 2, corporate engagement. Number 3, climate voting. And lastly, we have a sustainability review process on a quarterly basis. So let's talk about climate rating, number 1. So climate rating is an assessment tool that Fidelity developed to evaluate and categorize our invested companies based on how strong is their potential to transition to net zero pathway. And this rating actually enables us to assess our proper alignment to net zero and to prompt engagement with laggards. So as of end of last year, the climate rating, we have covered around slightly more than 2,000 issuers. Moving on to the second tool, which is corporate engagement. So engagement with companies is a key approach for us to drive real decarbonization impact. And how we do it is we have direct engagement with them on climate change, and this is mostly driven by our climate voting policy or our thematic engagement programs. Secondly, we join several investor groups such as I mentioned, AIGCC or even PRI to conduct collaborative engagement with the top carbon emitters. We also have developed a specific policy to engage intensively with companies on their transition pathways with the high carbon emitters to engage with them on how they actually can transition away, phase out their carbon intensive activities. This is to support our goal to phase out our exposure to thermal coal globally by 2040. As of last year, we conducted about 2,100 ESG engagements globally with slightly more than 1,500 companies. And 54% of our engagement is focused on climate, whereas 21% is on nature laws. So nature laws, biodiversity is an upcoming topic that we talk to companies nowadays. Moving on to the third tool, which is climate voting. Now we've introduced in 2022 last year a climate voting policy, which sets out our minimum expectations on climate disclosure. This is an important tool for us to actually escalate our concerns on how companies manage climate change related risks and opportunities. Just to give you a sense, we voted close to 4,000 shareholder meetings in 2022 last year. And upon engagement and analysis, we did not support 58 companies that failed our minimum expectations on climate change. And lastly, about quarterly sustainability review. This is actually to bring all the key stakeholders, including the CIO, portfolio managers, and sustainable investing team together and to discuss topics such as the climate rating profiles of the invested companies, the engagement status, and then climate-related votes of the fund. So this process actually helps to bring the outputs of the three tools I mentioned earlier and other sustainability aspects together and to monitor how funds actually integrate climate and other ESG factors into the portfolio.
Thank you. So just following up on the engagement side, which is, I think, included in all of your sort of stewardship practices. When you engage on climate, how do you approach prioritization and also target setting? Ali, can I come to you for this question?
Sure. So when we think about prioritization, the factors that we consider are a few. One is whether climate change is material to the companies. Are they in the the carbon intensive sectors? The size of our holdings, are they in our top holdings? And whether they are laggards or leaders. And when it comes to forming our expectations for invested companies and what targets they should aim for, we will actually refer to international framework or guidelines issued by organizations such as TCFD, IEA, and Transition Pathway Initiative. And we understand that developing strategy and targets to address climate-related risks and opportunities is a journey. It's unrealistic to expect a step change from companies. And therefore, in our engagement with companies, we will look for incremental improvement and set interim milestones for them. And at the same time, assess their commitment levels towards achieving the bigger goals.
Thank you. Nancy, can you comment on this point as well?
Yeah, I think Ali offered a very comprehensive sharing when it comes to prioritization. So I'd like to touch more on the target setting part. I think when we think about the climate target setting, often we find determining the difficult part, as there are already globally aligned long-term targets in place that apply regardless of which region or which asset class you run. At Prudential, as a result, we have made a public commitment to reach our portfolio net zero by 2050. But I do think it's often the process of how we reach the goal and how to set interim targets that's most difficult and challenging. And the process can be largely uncertain and also depend on the regional context. So therefore, we see stewardship as a way to increase the transparency and certainty, because through each of the dialogue, we get more information from what the company is doing to improve their climate-related management or to decarbonize. And also we give them a chance to understand that what we prioritize when it comes to decarbonization. So specifically, we set a target to engage with companies responsible for 65% of the absolute emissions in our investment portfolio. And this is an annually refreshed target that our stewardship team will perform annually. And I think the last point I'd like to make here is that as investors, our levers and the effective means of influence can differ quite drastically. So for us as a long-term asset owner, I think we're quite fortunate to have a more patient time frame, and in order to encourage some of the continuous improvement that Ellie mentioned just now. And I think this really enables us to devise a set of milestones and escalation pathways to really partner with the investees and together to decarbonize our portfolio.
Thank you, Nancy. Just another sort of quick question on the engagement side. And you mentioned regional context. And I think engagement is a relatively new thing in Asia, and particularly in emerging Asia, and may require additional considerations. And I think Valerie talked about that as well. So how does your engagement approach differ when focusing on emerging markets or in Asia?
Yeah, thanks for raising this, Aya. I think this is indeed core to our considerations. And I think earlier Valerie made a great point about the diversity of regional specificities in Asia. But now I want to share some of the common challenges faced by all these emerging markets. So today, as we speak, there are around 770 million people who are still living without any access to electricity. And most of them are living in Africa and Asia, the two regions that we exclusively operate in. So as these communities start to grow their population and develop their economy, so will the energy demand and inevitably the emissions. Now, if we contrast this to their developed market counterparts who have already reaped the economic growth benefit with fossil fuels and have the financial capacity to finance this decarbonization. So for us at Prudential, we recognize that it would be devastating for the emerging markets if we simply pull investment out just because of a rising emission and not consider the social impact that come with. So instead, how we can find ways to help them decarbonize is more appropriately, I think, is through engagement on activities that help them adapt to the structural changes in their economy and development that are climate conscious. So for example, this can be a requirement on companies to put in place a transition plan, or discussions on strategies should evolve in order to align to a decarbonization pathway. And I think currently at the moment, we're also exploring how to finance projects that support the transition in a more just and inclusive manner. So in conclusion, I think our stewardship approach for emerging markets is guided by our consideration of each country's emissions, their population, GDP, as well as other factors to really bring flexibility into how we achieve our 2050 net zero targets.
Thank you. And Valerie, you spoke about on this topic as well. I wonder if you have any comments to make on or anything to highlight on this point.
Thank you, Aya. And I think there are so many great points that were being raised. It only underpins the level of complexity that we're dealing with in terms of climate change, in particular in the context of focusing the engagement on climate change with emerging market players. It also just lends the view of not focusing on a overly binary view in the process of understanding how we engage with EMs. So I think I might risk sort of preaching to the converted here, but understanding that diverse nature of Asian markets, even within Asia, that's the number one thing that we need to establish. And I think maybe alluded to some of the from some of the comments that others have made earlier on, the need to factor into the diversities, but I would also often add the layer of what sector we are talking about, because those decarbonization pathways would be different. Are we talking about a company with controlled holdings, a state-owned enterprise or not? All of these will have a nuanced effect in terms of how the most effective way of engaging with that said company might need to be different. Therefore, noting that particular sector and companies' role in the country's energy transition is important, because then you can pick on the main levers and have the most relevant conversations accordingly. In the context of emerging markets, I think people won't be surprised if the nationally determined contributions gets sort of brought into the conversation. So understanding that context and the national priorities from within is important. All of that being said, though, I just want to also emphasize the importance of having this sort of against the backdrop of the complexities within emerging markets that we're all sort of experiencing when engaging from within. The science-based elements of the expected targets that we put forward as and when we engage with companies, it's also important. I fully recognize that we don't have all of the pathways as clearly mapped out as we have, say, for example, for the utility sector, because that sort of the pathways ahead are straightforward. We understand that with the IEA Net Zero 2050 scenario, unabated coal power needs to be phased out in advanced economies by 2030. But we don't use the same timeline with emerging markets. We give out a 2040 expectation for other regions. But even so, I'm sure that people engaging with emerging markets in the utility sector will still sort of face challenges even with that narrative. But at the very least, we have that science-based narrative underpinning all of this discussion. And so for this conversation, for it to maintain as an open dialogue, as in one that doesn't completely shut doors down and end conversations right there and then, I think it's important for us to also consider the milestones. If they're not the same as the ones that we're seeing at the moment, how do they actually look like? Engage with the companies to have them sort of deliver what their expectations of the milestones are like. How far away are they from the NDCs, if at all? Because that would be a bottom line that they will definitely need to meet. And if it's, say, for example, steel, another sector that I've been very much focused on of recent, what kind of, not only confined to steel, but any industries that sort of has to do with emerging technologies, what levels of investments are companies putting into this? Are they sort of, is there a risk of over-reliance, or are they utilizing their core competencies more importantly? Because emerging markets, they may not have the amount of capital that advanced economies have, but they must sort of look into what their core competencies are in the regional context. And I think having that kind of strategic conversation with the companies would bring in much more appreciation from their part as well, because they truly see that as a dialogue of let's sort of, we're in this together, let's resolve the problems at hand. So I think all of these are conversations that we might need to take into consideration. And also, if sort of, I should have mentioned when I brought up SOEs, if the target company is an SOE, what is their role in shaping the NDCs, for example? All of these, will bring in a combination of very interesting sort of different ways of engaging with the companies. So, and therefore, for that reason, the strategy of engaging with them will need to be tailored accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. Very important point. We've discussed the engagement quite a bit. So let's discuss a little bit about tools other than engagement, proxy voting and shareholder proposals. Ali, let me come to you for this one. So could you share how proxy voting complements your engagement approach on climate and how you use that in Asia?
Sure. So to us, voting and engagement come hand in hand. So as mentioned by Bonnie from PRI, we too observe that voting actually strengthens engagement, and engagement fits into our voting decisions. So to illustrate this, I will use our climate voting policy as an example. So in this policy, we have set out a minimum expectations, such as companies in the carbon-intensive sectors should start reporting greenhouse gas emissions and to have a reduction target. And what's the impact on companies is that for companies that do not meet our expectations, we'll have to vote against the directors. Now, although this climate voting policy was effective in January last year, the engagement started way before the actual implementation. So several months before implement that, we communicated our policy by sending letters to about 3,000 companies in 2021. So when it comes to 2022, we sent a more targeted emails to companies that do not seem to meet our expectation at that time. And as a result, we actually observed that companies are more responsive to our emails and are more willing to have calls with us, whereby we took these opportunities to discuss with them about climate change, this topic, the policy, the implication of policy, and to also understand how they are actually meeting our expectations. That something that we could not know from just reading their reports, which are just a snapshot of what they have done in the past, right? So the engagement in various forms and at different points in time are very important to informing our voting decisions. When it comes to shareholder meetings, by the time we would have sufficient information to decide whether to support or vote against directors in accordance to these climate voting policies. And post-shareholder meetings, the voting decision will also trigger conversations with invested companies as a follow-up on how they plan to improve their management of the climate-related risks in the future before next annual meeting. So just to summarize, voting and engagement truly complement each other very well in our perspective.
Thank you very much, Ali. I'm conscious of time, so just last question before moving on to Q&A. But I wanted to ask a question about how the stewardship activities on climate feeds into the rest of the investment process. So, Corinne, may I ask you to quickly explain how the outcome of stewardship activities feed back into your engagement, investment analysis, and also risk management?
Sure. So essentially, the incremental costs arising from climate change and environmental risk management are factored into our analyst financial models post-engagement. And these are being used to project the future earnings and cash flow forecasts for the company. And it may also feed back into our analyst ratings on these investee companies and issuers. And specifically for listed equities, our analysts would also apply a valuation premium or discount to the fundamental fair value to arrive at the price target. And the resultant upside or downside versus the current share price and how the stock is expected to perform relative to its sector peers would then determine whether the stock is a buy, hold, or sell. And our portfolio managers will then take all this into account in their portfolio construction. And ultimately, to Valerie's point, to all our panelists' point, engagement is really two-way. We are encouraged that some of our investee companies also actively engage and consult us on ESG matters and mutually exchange our experiences in this decarbonization journey. So they often ask us for our feedback, what kind of information we would like to see in their ESG report or disclosures as investors, the opportunities for improvement, and then we go back and revisit our investment thesis again about this company.
Thank you, Corinne, and that's very helpful. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for your insightful and very specific comments on very specific practices. And we're going into the Q&A session from now. We welcome your questions through the chat box. So please ask the question. Bonnie is back, I think, for this session. So you can ask questions for both session 1 and session 2. And while we wait, we actually took some questions in advance of the session. So I'd like to maybe start with that question. And that question relates to stewardship practices for asset classes other than listed equity. I think there were some discussions in the panelists, the panel discussion as well, but our stewardship discussion is often focused on listed equity, but investors are increasingly working on other asset classes as well. So perhaps may I ask the investors, panelists, to maybe discuss what you're doing in the asset classes other than listed equity. Perhaps, NC, can I ask you to comment?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this one. I think there are indeed many ways we can exert a positive influence across other asset classes. And sovereign debt for us is a very special asset class. As the issues we just discussed earlier on just transition, it will be more prominent at the level of sovereign than at a corporate level. So we must take care that the metrics we use do not unintentionally drive investments away from the regions where the most investment will be needed to reduce emissions. And as a result, we've been searching for the right indicators. So one specific framework we've been closely monitoring is called the ASCOR, which is short for Assessing Sovereign Climate-Related Risk Opportunities and Risks. So they provided some thoughtful considerations. For example, it proposed to look at not only the country's current emissions, but also the historical emission to look at how much are they responsible for the emissions accumulated to date. And they also look at not only the climate risk exposure, but given the vulnerability, the adaptation mechanisms. So I think this ASCOR framework is still in development. We think this might be relevant for our investor friends to consider. And another quick win within the fixed income asset class, I think, would be labeled bonds, such as green bond, transition bond, which help create a great channel to co-develop some of the climate-related targets with the investees. I think naturally they will have more incentive to work with us to have a shared interest in achieving the climate-related goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Corinne, do you have any comments on this question?
Yeah, so actually for us, we have a uniform approach. We conduct regular thematic engagements covering our 2 largest asset classes, fixed income and equities. And the same topics, same questions are sent to the issuers of both asset classes. And our research analysts then follow up and score the investee companies based on their responses accordingly. We also invest in alternative assets. So for our direct real estate, private debt, private equity, and venture capital, we work closely with our general partners, and we conduct ESG due diligence assessments using our own in-house developed scorecard as well before we onboard them. And we would engage the GPs on a regular basis to discuss climate and other ESG related matters as well.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. Just to add from my side, PRI has been coordinating a collaborative sovereign engagement on climate since last year, and running a pilot program in Australia. So I'd be happy to share more information if anyone's interested. Okay, so some questions are coming through the chat. The first question came in for AIGCC. So Valerie, that's for you. Do you have examples or a list of questions available for asset owners and asset managers to use in engaging with the companies?
Thank you for the question. The answer, if it's looking for one list where you can refer to for all of the engagements, unfortunately, would be there's no such one single list. However, I will definitely point you to a few of the resources that we have mentioned earlier on. And maybe, I don't know, Bonnie, you might want to jump in later on as well with some of the PRI resources. But definitely the net zero company benchmark, that whilst it's sort of an assessment for the designated list of companies within CA100+, I think the framework itself is a very useful reference for you to engage using that as a framework, even if it's not the company is not a CA100+ one, to basically for you to ask questions around the company's strategy, around their oversight on climate, strategies on decarbonization, the sort of capital allocation, whether it's aligned with net zero, and of course, sort of their ambition levels, the targets that they're setting. All of these are within the net zero company benchmark. And in particular for companies outside of the CA100+ list of companies, you can also, of course, look at the Asia Engagement Guide, where we sort of benchmark that and link up the relevant indicators that we see within the TPI tool as well. For example, the TPI tool focuses on a wider range of questions, looking into whether they call it the management quality and the carbon performance indicators respectively, mainly to see if there are questions that you can ask of the management to identify if they have that capability on climate oversight, and also the actual carbon performance, which is the other spectrum of the metrics that they look at, and a list of other tools, the investor expectations for different sectors. All of these, I think, would give you good insight as you engage with the companies. Very often you'll find actual questions from within these guides which you can use with the companies, but I don't think there's one single list of questions that you could, because every company, we've been talking about the nuancing element, that's highly important. Definitely you need to draw up a list of questions that's uniquely relevant for the company that you're engaging with.
Just to jump in there, the PRI will probably have a range of different resources. Echo the comment that there's no one place, but recently relating to human rights, we've published a practical guide in due diligence for human rights risks, and in the appendix there is a list of asset owner questions for investment managers, but as part of the due diligence questions there is a company level section around the risks to look out for, so it may be that you could either create questions from that specific to company engagement, but I will share a link in the chat and that we can include that in the follow-up resources.
Thanks, Barry and Bonnie. The last question before we come to conclusion, that's for Ellie. If Fidelity invests in government bond, the tools that you normally use is climate rating rather than engagement, correct?
We do invest in government bonds. Currently, we haven't had a firm-wide. We're still developing our strategy towards engaging with sovereigns. So on these, we'll have to. I think we'll have to rely on PRI we'll get some guidance from PRI upcoming sovereign debt issuer engagement guidelines.
Okay, thank you very much, Ellie. So I think we've come to, we've reached time to conclude the Q&A session. I'd like to thank all the speakers for sharing their insights, and I will hand it back to our Master of Ceremony for closing.
Thank you all so much, the speakers, the panelists, and the moderator, for such a remarkable presentation. And thank you so much for all the insight of today's main topic, responsible investment in practice, undertaking stewardship with a focus on climate change. And as for today's webinar has come to its conclusion, we would also like all participants to please scan the QR code with your phones to take a survey on today's activities, or click on the link to the survey in the chat box as well. So your comments will help us make the next session even better. And all the slide presentations of today and the webinar should also be downloaded and posted on the SEC Thailand website as well. So you can check it out at worldwideweb.sec.or.th. So we truly hope that today's discussion will allow us to better understand the importance and relevance of climate change in the context of the investment process and how market participants could incorporate this into responsible investment policies, investment processes, and stewardship practices to help develop a sustainable capital market for all. Thank you all so much for the kind participation on this seminar. As we reach the end of the conference, heartfelt thanks goes to the organization committee, including the United Nations, the PRI, and Asian Investor Group on Climate Change, or AIGCC. Without them, the conference would not have been possible. And also thank you, the interpreter, for your kind support as well. We would like to apologize for any mistakes during the event, and we hope to see you again soon. Goodbye, and thank you very much. สวัสดีค่ะ